Grace stood in the dim light of her small apartment, the evening sun casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Boxes were stacked high around her, each one filled with the remnants of her old life, Tom's life. It had been months since his sudden death, but the grief still hung over her like a heavy fog. The world felt colder, more distant. And now, with the unpaid bills piling up and a young daughter to raise, she was left with no choice but to sell his things, piece by painful piece. Her fingers trembled as she pulled another book from the shelf. It was Tom's favorite, Of Mice and Men. As she flipped through the worn pages, something slipped out and fluttered to the floor. A sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges. Grace froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't seen this before. Why had he hidden it? With shaking hands, she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Tom's unmistakable handwriting. Grace, it began, if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me, and I'm no longer with you. I need you to know that I made a decision, one that might be hard for you to understand. Grace's heart raced as she continued reading, her eyes scanning each word faster than the next. Her chest tightened. Tom had secretly been donating all of their savings to a girl named Abby, a total stranger to Grace. He had written about Abby's desperate need for a heart transplant and how he felt compelled to help her, even if it meant sacrificing their financial security. But why had he kept this from her, and why this girl? The letter hinted at a deeper connection, one he never had the chance to explain. She dropped the letter, her mind spinning with confusion, anger, and something else, betrayal. Tom had left her and their daughter, not only in death, but in debt, all for someone she had never even heard of. The next morning, Grace stood in front of her laptop, typing Abby heart transplant into the search bar. Her mind was still reeling from the letter, but one thing was clear. She needed answers. Why had Tom done this? What could possibly make him hide something so important from her? A few clicks later, she found an article. There it was, Abby Davis. A photo of a teenage girl stared back at her, smiling as if she had no idea her life had been bought with someone else's sacrifice. Abby had received the transplant just months before Tom's accident. Grace's throat tightened as she scrolled through the article. Abby wasn't just any girl. She had saved Tom's life once when they were both children. The details were vague, but it seemed they had been involved in some terrible accident together. Grace's heart pounded as a new realization settled over her. This wasn't just about charity. It was about something much deeper. She needed to find this girl. It wasn't hard to track Abby down. The article mentioned that she worked at a small cafe downtown, trying to save up money for college. Grace stood outside the cafe now, her hands sweating as she stared at the entrance. Should she go in? What could she possibly say to this girl? She almost turned away, but something pulled her forward. She pushed open the door, the smell of coffee and fresh pastries hitting her senses. There behind the counter was Abby. She was smaller than Grace expected, with short black hair and dark eyes that flicked up as Grace entered. She looked so young, so innocent. Grace's stomach twisted. How could this girl have such a hold on Tom? How could he have done this to their family? "Hi, can I help you?" Abby's voice was light, but it broke through Grace's chaotic thoughts like a splash of cold water. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak right away. I think you knew my husband," Grace finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Abby frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Your husband? I'm sorry, I don't." "Tom," Grace interrupted, watching as Abby's eyes widened in shock. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, Grace felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Finally, Abby understood. "Oh my God," Abby whispered, stepping back from the counter. "Tom was your husband?" The tension between them crackled in the air, thick and electric. Abby looked like she had just seen a ghost, and Grace felt as if she was staring at the girl who had taken her whole life away. Grace couldn't stop staring at Abby. The shock on the young woman's face mirrored her own disbelief. For a moment, neither spoke. The cafe seemed to quiet around them, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Grace took a deep breath, fighting to control the swirl of emotions bubbling up inside her. Rage, sorrow, confusion. Abby's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Then, she finally whispered, "Tom? Tom saved my life?" Her voice was shaky, filled with awe and disbelief. Grace nodded, barely able to keep her voice steady. He gave up everything. He gave you all of our savings so you could have that heart transplant. The words stung as they left her mouth, and she could see the weight of them settling on Abby. But what Grace didn't expect was the flood of tears that sprang to the young girl's eyes. Abby quickly wiped them away, but it was too late. Grace had already seen the depth of her emotion. Abby wasn't the villain she had imagined. She was just a girl, one who had no idea what had been sacrificed for her. I didn't know. Abby's voice cracked. I didn't know he did that. He never told me. Grace's chest tightened. She had come here for answers, maybe even for someone to blame, but Abby's raw reaction was something she wasn't prepared for. The anger she had been holding onto began to slip through her fingers, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. Why didn't he tell me? Grace whispered, more to herself than to Abby. Abby shook her head, her face pale and stricken. I don't know. I didn't even realize he was married. He just said he wanted to help, that he owed me for something that happened when we were kids. Grace's eyes narrowed. What happened? Before Abby could answer, the door to the cafe swung open, and a group of customers walked in, shattering the fragile moment between them. Abby looked torn, glancing between Grace and the new customers. She gave Grace a pleading look. Can we talk later? After my shift? Please. Grace hesitated, but then nodded. Fine. Where? There's a park a few blocks from here. I'll meet you there in an hour. Grace sat on a weathered park bench, her heart still pounding in her chest. She watched as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the grassy field. Her mind raced with questions, the unanswered ones gnawing at her insides. Why had Tom kept this from her? What had happened between him and Abby all those years ago that could make him feel like he owed her his life? Her thoughts were interrupted when she saw Abby approaching, her face still pale but determined. She sat down next to Grace, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. Tom never told me much, Abby began softly, her eyes downcast. But I remember that day, the day he saved me. Grace turned to her, frowning. What do you mean? He saved you? The letter said you saved him. Abby nodded slowly. I did, but it wasn't just that. Years later, when I was a kid, I was playing near some train tracks. I don't even remember how I ended up there, but I got stuck. Tom was nearby, and he pulled me off the tracks just as the train came. She shuddered, her voice trembling at the memory. He saved my life that day. I always felt like I owed him, and when I got sick, he didn't hesitate. He told me that he was repaying an old debt. Grace stared at her, stunned. All this time, she had thought Abby was just a random stranger Tom had helped out of some sense of charity. But now it seemed like the connection between them ran far deeper than she had imagined. That's why he gave you everything, Grace whispered, the pieces slowly falling into place. Because you saved his life once, and he saved yours. Abby nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. I didn't want to take anything from him. I swear, I didn't know. I would have found another way. Grace looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of Tom's choices in a way she hadn't before. But she wasn't done asking questions. There was still more to this story, more that didn't make sense. Why didn't he tell me? Grace asked again, her voice firmer this time. Why keep it from me? We were supposed to share everything. He knew how hard things were for us. Abby looked down, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the bench. I don't know. Maybe he didn't want you to feel burdened. Or maybe... She hesitated, her brow furrowing in thought. Maybe what? Abby glanced at Grace, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Maybe he didn't want to remind you of the accident. Grace froze. What accident? The one from when you were kids, Abby said softly. Tom told me that he never wanted to talk about it. He said it changed him, made him realize how fragile life is, but he didn't say more. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She remembered bits and pieces, flashes of memory she had tried to bury. There had been an accident when she and Tom were younger, something she had pushed to the back of her mind. Could it really have been the reason for all of this? Could it explain why Tom had felt such a strong connection to Abby? Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of her phone. She glanced down to see a text from her mother, asking if she was coming home for dinner. The message brought her back to reality. There were still so many unanswered questions, but for now, she needed time to process everything. Later that night, Grace sat in her daughter's bedroom, watching the little girl sleep. The peaceful rise and fall of her daughter's chest reminded her of what was truly important. Tom's choices may have been difficult to understand, but at the heart of it all was love. Love for her, for their daughter, and for Abby. She couldn't change what Tom had done, but she could choose how to move forward. In the days that followed, Grace and Abby met several more times. Each conversation revealed new layers to Tom's story, new reasons for his actions. Grace found herself softening toward Abby, no longer seeing her as the girl who had taken her husband's savings, but as someone who had shared a deep, life-altering bond with him. Slowly, Grace began to understand the complexity of Tom's love. The love that had led him to make choices that weren't easy or simple, but were, in his eyes, the right thing to do. One afternoon, as they sat together at the cafe where Abby worked, Grace finally voiced the thought that had been nagging at her since the beginning. "Do you think Tom knew he was going to die? That's why he gave you everything?" Abby looked down at her cup of coffee, her expression unreadable. "I don't know, but sometimes it felt like he was saying goodbye." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Grace's heart ached. Maybe Tom had known. Maybe, in his own way, he had been trying to prepare her for a world without him. Weeks passed, and though Grace was beginning to heal, the questions surrounding Tom's actions still haunted her. Late one night, as she sorted through the last of Tom's personal effects, something unexpected fell from his old coat pocket. Another letter. This one was addressed not to her, but to Abby. Her heart pounded as she stared at the envelope, her hand trembling. Why had Tom written another letter, and why hadn't Abby mentioned it? Grace debated whether she should open it. After everything they had been through, maybe it was time to let the past rest. But her fingers betrayed her, sliding the envelope open before she could stop herself. Inside, the letter was brief, but what it revealed shattered Grace's understanding of Tom's secret life. "Abby," it began, "I don't know if you'll ever need this, but in case something happens to me, you should know the truth. I made choices I regret, but this one is for you. I have one last thing to give you. It's not just my money, it's something bigger than that." The letter ended abruptly, as if Tom hadn't been able to finish. Grace's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. What had he meant by something bigger? What else had he hidden, and why hadn't he told her this himself? Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting her thoughts. It was Abby. Without thinking, Grace grabbed the letter and rushed out the door, her mind spinning with questions. She found herself outside Abby's apartment, pounding on the door with an urgency she hadn't felt before. Abby opened the door, surprised to see her so late. "Grace, what's going on?" Grace didn't waste any time. She thrust the letter at Abby, her eyes blazing with frustration and confusion. "Did you know about this? Did you know Tom was planning something else?" Abby's face paled as she took the letter from Grace's trembling hand. Her eyes scanned the words, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. "No, I didn't know. I had no idea he wrote this." Grace stepped inside, her emotions boiling over. "There's something else, Abby? Something he didn't tell either of us. He said he had something bigger to give you. What does that mean?" Abby shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know, Grace. I swear, I don't know." But Grace wasn't satisfied. The letter had stirred something deep inside her, something she couldn't ignore. She knew there was more to Tom's story, something that had been buried even deeper than his donation to Abby. And now she had to find out what it was. Determined to uncover the truth, Grace and Abby worked together, retracing Tom's steps in the months leading up to his death. They went through bank records, old emails, and anything they could find that might give them a clue. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least not at first. Then, Grace remembered something. Tom had been meeting someone regularly at a local law office. At the time, she had assumed it was just work-related, but now she wasn't so sure. The next day, Grace and Abby went to the law office, desperate for answers. The receptionist, an older woman with kind eyes, recognized Tom's name immediately. "Yes, Mr. Thompson had been coming here for a few months," she said softly. "He was working on something very important. I believe he wanted it to be a surprise for you." Grace exchanged a confused glance with Abby. "What kind of surprise?" The woman gave them a sympathetic smile. "I think you'll need to speak with Mr. Jenkins, the lawyer. He's been handling Tom's estate."
Hey there, quick message. Grab a paper, write down HeroKind Stories, our channel name. Come back soon, we've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
Grace and Abby sat in the lawyer's office, the air thick with tension. Mr. Jenkins, a gray-haired man with sharp features, rifled through a folder of documents before finally speaking. "Tom came to me a few months before his death to set up a trust fund," Jenkins began, his voice calm and measured. "But it wasn't just a financial arrangement. Tom made a very specific request." Grace's stomach twisted. "What request?" Jenkins glanced between Grace and Abby, hesitating for a moment before continuing. "Tom wanted to give Abby something more than just money. He arranged to donate a portion of his heart to you, Abby." Abby's face went white. "What do you mean? He was alive when I got my transplant. That doesn't make any sense," Jenkins sighed. "Tom had an extremely rare genetic condition. It didn't affect his health right away, but he knew it would eventually. He worked with a medical team to see if his heart could be used as a backup in case anything went wrong with your transplant. He wanted to make sure that, even in death, he could give you a chance at life." Grace gasped, her mind reeling. Tom had known all along that he was living on borrowed time. He had planned not only to give Abby their savings, but also a literal piece of himself, should she ever need it. His love, his sacrifice, had gone far beyond anything Grace could have imagined. Abby sat frozen, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't know he was sick." The weight of Tom's final gift hung heavy in the air. Grace couldn't speak. The revelation was too much to process. All this time, she had been angry at Tom for leaving her and their daughter in a financial mess, but the truth was so much more heartbreaking. He had been preparing for his death long before it happened. He had been ready to give Abby everything, his heart, his life, and his future. Tears streamed down Abby's face, and she buried her head in her hands. "I don't deserve this," she sobbed. "I didn't want him to do this for me. He should have been with you, Grace, with your daughter." Grace's heart ached as she reached out and touched Abby's shoulder, her own tears falling silently. "None of us knew, but Tom, he loved us both in his own way." The two women sat together, bonded by their shared grief and the overwhelming weight of Tom's choices. There were no easy answers, no clear path forward, but in that moment they understood each other in a way no one else could. Days later, as Grace stood in her daughter's room watching her sleep, she felt a strange sense of peace. Tom's choices had been painful, yes, but they had been rooted in love. He had made the ultimate sacrifice, not just for Abby, but for their family. And now, Grace had a choice to make too. The next morning, Grace called Abby. "Let's meet," she said. "There's something I want to talk to you about." Abby sounded hesitant. "What is it?" Grace smiled softly. "I think it's time we move forward, together." The two women had been brought together by Tom's secret life, but in the end, it was their shared bond that would help them heal. They were connected by more than just his sacrifice. They were connected by the love he had for them both. Weeks had passed since the revelation of Tom's ultimate sacrifice. Grace and Abby found themselves spending more time together, their bond growing stronger with each meeting. What had started as a relationship filled with tension and misunderstanding was now transforming into an unlikely friendship, one built on shared grief, mutual respect, and a deeper understanding of the man who had connected them both. One sunny afternoon, they sat together on a park bench, watching Grace's daughter Mia play in the distance. Abby's eyes softened as she watched the little girl chase after a butterfly, her laughter filling the air. "She's beautiful," Abby said softly, her voice carrying a mix of admiration and sadness. "Tom must have adored her." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with pride and pain. "He did. She was his world." The two women sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their shared loss hanging between them. But there was something different in the air now, something lighter. Grace could feel it, a quiet sense of closure creeping in. They had both been through so much, but now there was a glimmer of hope for the future. As they walked back toward the cafe where Abby still worked, Grace hesitated before speaking. There was something she had been considering for a while. something that had been growing in her heart ever since she had learned the full extent of Tom's plans. "I've been thinking about something," Grace said, breaking the silence. Abby glanced over at her, curious. "What is it?" Grace took a deep breath. "I want you to come live with us." Abby's eyes widened, her mouth opening in shock. "What?" "Grace, I can't." "You can," Grace interrupted, her tone firm but kind. "You don't have family here. You've been struggling on your own, and, well, you're a part of our lives now. Whether we like it or not, Tom brought us together, and I think he would want us to be there for each other." Abby stared at her, clearly taken aback by the offer. "I don't know what to say." Grace, that's too much. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Grace insisted. "You're family. Whether you knew it or not, Tom made sure of that. I think it's time we honor his memory by sticking together." Tears filled Abby's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. She had spent so long feeling like an outsider, like a stranger in Grace's life. But now, for the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she belonged. I don't know what to say," Abby whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Grace. Thank you for giving me a second chance." The decision for Abby to move in wasn't easy, but it was the right one. Grace's small apartment felt a little fuller now, a little warmer. Mia adored having Abby around, and the two had quickly bonded in a way Grace hadn't expected. Abby had become a part of their family, not as a replacement for Tom, but as someone who understood their loss and shared in their healing. One evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, Mia's laughter filling the room, Grace couldn't help but smile. The pain of Tom's absence was still there, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been. They were moving forward, together, just as Tom would have wanted. After dinner, Grace found herself in the living room, looking at a framed photo of Tom on the shelf. His eyes twinkled in the picture, his smile as warm as ever. She felt a pang of sadness, but also a deep sense of peace. "I miss you," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible. "But I know you're still here, in a way. I know you brought Abby into our lives for a reason." As the days passed, Grace and Abby started talking about ways they could honor Tom's memory. It wasn't enough to simply move on. They wanted to do something that would keep his spirit alive, something that would reflect the kind of man he had been. Together, they came up with an idea, a small scholarship fund in Tom's name to help young people like Abby who needed a second chance at life. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was meaningful. It was something that felt right. With the little money Abby had saved and a portion of the remaining savings Tom had left, they started the Tom Thompson Memorial Fund, a scholarship for students in need of medical assistance and support. The fund wasn't just about money. It was about hope, about giving people the chance to live their lives fully, just as Tom had wanted for Abby. Months later, as Grace stood on her balcony watching the sunset, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. Life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. She had lost the love of her life, but in his place, she had found a new kind of love, a friendship, a family, and a purpose she hadn't seen coming. Abby joined her on the balcony, handing her a cup of tea. "It's a beautiful night," she said, looking out at the sky, the colors swirling in a breathtaking display. Grace nodded. "It is." They stood in silence, watching the sky darken, the stars slowly appearing. Grace glanced over at Abby, feeling grateful for the bond they had formed. It wasn't the life she had expected, but it was a good life. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As the days turned into months and the months into years, Grace and Abby continued to live side by side, their friendship growing deeper with each passing day. The pain of Tom's loss would never fully disappear, but it had softened into something they could both live with, something that reminded them of the love and sacrifice that had brought them together. They honored Tom's memory in small ways, through the scholarship fund, through the stories they shared with Mia, and through the lives they lived every day. And though the road ahead would no doubt hold challenges, they were ready to face it together. Because in the end, love wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about moving forward, carrying the people you've lost with you, and finding new ways to live and love. Thank you for being a part of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And before you go, check out the video that's appearing on your screen now. It's another powerful story of love, sacrifice, and unexpected connections that you won't want to miss.